All right, we might as well get started. Welcome, everybody, to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for ethical risk, good governance, bias, and disparate impact. Today, we're going to thankfully be moving away from the talk of AI regulations and the New York City and the DC regulations on AI. We're going to talk about something that's very exciting to me, which is sort of the dance between the technical parts of this whole field and some of the socio-technical elements. And I'm happy to be joined by Beau, who is someone who I've admired his work for a long time, and met Beau last year when he was organizing a very wonderful Mozilla session that he kindly invited me to. And since then, I've asked him to come help us out at Babel, and Beau has joined our ethical risk assessment team, which is super exciting, and also taken on a lot of some of the early policy work. And so luckily Beau was the one who sort of wrangled and led the most recent comments on FTC guidelines that we had. So I'm going to let Beau introduce himself, and then we can launch into sort of a discussion on some of these issues.
I'm really excited to be here. That's the first thing I want to say. So my name is Borhane Blili-Hamelin. You can just call me Beau. I pronounce my name in French, which is a little challenging. So I'm a researcher, I'm a consultant, I'm an organizer focused on AI ethics. I have a PhD in philosophy from Columbia University. I also have expertise on algorithmic accountability, on risk management, and on stakeholder engagement. And the other thing, and this is kind of what leads us to the conversation today, is that I'm also active in the machine learning research community. So the thing that, I want to start by emphasizing is, like, for me, like one of my deep passions in the AI risk space. That's kind of why I'm here. That's how I met Shea. That's behind a lot of the work I've been doing, is the challenge of building bridges across silos. There's so many parts of this work where different communities, different economic sectors, different industries, but also different expert groups, folks from with very, very different skills, really need to come together. And we need to come together very, very quickly. Without that, we can't do, a really good risk management. And the challenge of just navigating that is, like, one of my deep passions. That's actually, how I met Shea. So I founded this project called Accountability Case Labs. The goal is, for me, I believe that participatory workshops are actually an amazing tool for navigating the challenge of bridging gaps across silos. And what we started last year, is we focused on case studies, we focused on stakeholder engagement, and then we built some really, I think, fantastic participatory workshops, and we also did a little bit of research. And this is really this is how I got to know Shea, but also this is what drew me to AI risk management work at Babel. And today we're going to be exploring a different side of my work on this stuff. So folks in the AI risk space, and I mean, especially in industry, folks that follow the NIST, for instance, the NIST risk management framework work, we know that putting AI ethics in practice is very, very, very hard. And it turns out that in the machine learning research world, this challenge is also being very, very hard, and it's very, very top of mind. And that's really the premise for today's chat. That's the thing we want to be exploring. We're going to be exploring surprising parallels between the challenges of putting AI ethics into practice in industry versus in a research setting. And the background for this, and the kind of like the occasion, for us to talk about this is, I'm currently doing work in progress, work with my friend Leif Hancock. I've been working on this paper, and we recently presented it at a workshop at the NeurIPS conference. The thing we're thinking through in that paper feels extremely relevant for the folks on the side, AI risk management. It's also kind of an interesting case study in ways in which the problem of very, very neatly integrating ethics with the technical work that needs to happen in risk management, just how that plays out in different settings. And it just felt like an exciting place to start. So one thing I want to say to begin with is something about the Babel perspective on the need for seamless and really cross-functional integration between the ethics side of this work and the technical side of this work. This is at the center of the comments we wrote for the FTC. So like what ended up happening with this is like some of the comments are kind of like mini white papers, and one of the core ideas between like one of the chunks. So we noticed the FTC was asking all these questions about algorithmic errors. How do we measure them? How do we mitigate them? How prevalent are they? And one of the core, commitments at Babel that's behind, all of the work we do, is behind the many papers that the Babel team has published, is we need to understand AI system as socio-technical. That means at every layer, we need to think through the interactions between people and the technical tools. Not just at the level of data sets and models, but also before you even get a model and data set, but also what happens when you make decisions about, are we moving forward? What changes are we making? How are we assessing risk, and so on and so forth? Who might be impacted? Who might be impacted beyond the life cycle of a model? That's also another very, very big issue. And a core commitment we have at Babel is thinking about the technical part of this problem on its own is a mistake. It is really, really, really crucial to have two components working hand in hand, and that's the AI risk, and for us, like one of the tools we like and we prone is AI risk management. We also believe that there needs to be a governance part to this work. But crucially, the AI risk, assessment part of the puzzle for us, and it's the core of a paper that the Babel team published recently, needs to be seamlessly integrated with the part that looks for technical errors, with the part that looks for technical problems. And there needs to be a back and forth between those two components that is really deep and seamless, where both part of the work keep informing each other meaningfully. And really what's going on with the conversation today is, I wrote, again, this paper with Leif Hancock's lead, it's a work in progress, where we're exploring a version of that challenge that comes up in the machine learning research space. So that's the setup. Shea, is there anything you'd like to add on this background and the Babel perspective?
No, I think you summed it up very well, and it's something that I feel like luckily the community is starting to people are getting on board, and there was a whole community I think that was in the research side of things and AI ethics research that were aware of this, and I mean a lot of people critical theorists, they know that the perspective matters, and it just is now starting to trickle into practice, and that's what's exciting. And so, yeah, I totally agree with everything you said.
So I want to move on to a little bit more context, because the paper might sound like it's known territory for folks who are deep in the weeds of the machine learning research world. But for folks who aren't, for folks who are maybe like in industry, for folks who are maybe on the ethics side, this feels like important background. It's also just like an important part of the story of like why this is relevant for folks that are thinking about organizations. So the machine learning research world has recently, like very, very recently, started integrating ethical risk mitigation into the review process for papers, and that's a big, big deal. So one thing to know for folks in other fields in the machine learning world, the top publications are actually conference proceedings. Conferences like NeurIPS are among the tier 1 publications. If you're a machine learning researcher, this is where you want your papers to be. And conferences have sometimes like multiple tracks, but the core one where you get papers is the archival track. And for that archival part of the conference, the papers go through peer review like in any other field. And so what's happened recently since 2020, the NeurIPS conference, which is one of the premier conferences in this world, in the machine learning research world, has been trying to systematize its approach to taking ethical risk into account in submitting and reviewing papers. And that's led to the development, and it's very, very recent one, it's still, in its infancy, of an ethics review process. So just to give people a little bit of a story, papers get submitted on a deadline. The papers get sent to the people who are evaluating the paper for scientific merits, scientific significance, technical merits, and so on and so forth. We can loosely call that the technical review part. So those are the people who are supposed to be saying, this paper is outstanding, should be accepted. This paper is not outstanding, it should not be accepted. And what's happened at NeurIPS, and that's currently where the review process is at, is that they've inserted inside that process in the middle, so they give technical reviewers the option to flag papers for ethical concerns. And the papers that get flagged get sent off to a separate team that does ethics review. And you can think of that as like, it's kind of like a mini, like, like ethical risk assessment phase of the review process. The ethical review team doesn't have the power to say this paper is going to be rejected. Instead, what they do is they issue recommendations and then turn the decision back to the technical reviewers as well as the area chairs, which are kind of like the people who are like wrangling the process of reviewing a single paper. So that's a bit of the background, for the story. The core of this paper we just, that we're working on is simple idea. The ethics side of this process and the technical side of this process can't be kept separate. It's very clear right now, and it's very top of mind for folks in the machine learning community, that when it comes to the ethics side of this, you need to be thinking about things that folks think about in research ethics in other fields, and that's especially the treatment of human subjects, but also, how might this research be used? Questions about use are very, very obviously ethical questions, but we feel, especially outside of circles that are like deeply immersed in thinking about, AI systems as socio-technical and what that means for risk management, we feel like there's still this like lingering and sticky, perspective that wants to frame the technical part of evaluating the merits of machine learning work as separate from the ethics part. And the part of this whole conversation, so like there's like, there's many conversations happening in the machine learning research world about this. You can think of it as, in general, it's about like, ethical, social, and political values in machine learning research. And we jump in on a relatively narrow but incredibly important part of this, which has to do with benchmarks. So one of the unusual features of the machine learning research world, and it's a thing that's, like been picking up steam. Shea could probably like say like a lot more than I could about the whole like history of this. You have what is called benchmarks, which are metrics, performance metrics. This is how we're going to measure how well you do, plus data sets, and they're designed to be hard. They're also designed to help identify what models have state-of-the-art performance on different tasks. And so in recent years, like thinking like one like big moment from my perspective is the ImageNet competition and just how influential it's been in this world, but also like the benchmarking paradigm being so important. So what started to happen is that these benchmarks have become really like a core component of how machine learning research gets evaluated. So yeah, ImageNet is the super influential example. On some views, the causality question is tricky here, but on some views, ImageNet might have had like a big role and a big influence in the rise of popularity of deep learning models in the last decade. Again, the causality is tricky. And also anecdotally, some folks tout this like focus on benchmark performance in research as a really, really important step towards making machine learning research much, much more applicable in practice. In reality, we think this is like a lot more complicated, but this is a big part of what's happening with all of this. And so this is where our paper comes in. What we're looking at is so we acknowledge and we feel like the community is very, very clear-headed about the fact that benchmarks get used and there's risks that come with that. We feel like the community is very clear-headed about the fact that, there's treatment of human subject questions involved. But where the paper comes in is we really try to zero in on areas where it may seem like you're dealing with purely technical questions, but you're actually dealing with decisions that are highly, highly value-laden, and where thinking through those decisions correctly and carefully requires having an ethical risk management mindset. It requires being on the lookout for ethical risk, and this is kind of, like where the paper kicks off. One more thing to say about this paper. So at its core, it's a philosophy paper for machine learning researchers. We draw on philosophy of science, specifically feminist and anti-racist, philosophy of science. And one of the core things we do in the paper is And this starts from my co-author, Leif Hancock's just noticing, wait a minute, there's this paper that was written 20 years ago about IQ research, about human intelligence research, nothing to do with machines, really having to do with people. That's looking at the role of ethical values. And, like Leif just noticed, like, wait a minute, like the points that are made in the paper are incredibly similar to the points that people are starting to make about machine learning benchmarks. And so the starting point for the paper was like, can we write a paper and collaborate on something that like thinks through that connection? So what's the similarity between the two cases? It's kind of like a core part of like, what gets the paper ticking. We argue that machine learning benchmarks and IQ tests share similarities in their structure. They both involve setting standards for describing, for evaluating, and for comparing performance on intelligence-related tasks. Another core similarity is that they both enable research ecosystems focused on intelligence as practical performance. There's a related analogy here that might be helpful for folks who like aren't familiar with benchmarks. You can kind of think of benchmarks like standardized tests for algorithms. This would be another direction that's exciting to explore. But so having this conceptual parallel in mind, and this argument we make that there's structural similarity, that allows us to explore what insights from this fantastic old critical scholarship looking at the ways in which values enter into all the decisions that get made about human intelligence research. How can we unlock those lessons, bring those lessons into the machine learning space? And this is kind of like, this is the premise of the paper. So, like high level picture, there's, like really like three core areas where like, we highlight similarities between both like the human intelligence case, but also the machine learning benchmark case. And the first one is definitions and task selection. How do you define intelligence? And also, how do you define what tasks to evaluate on, and in a way that is like relevant to intelligence? How do you decide what tasks belong in a machine learning benchmark? To use an example, so recent, benchmarks meant for language models. There's this new benchmark called Helm that very prominently involves a test for toxicity. How good is this language model at dealing with toxicity? It's only meant to be one of very, very many challenges that the models that try to pass the Helm benchmark are meant to tackle. But it's very, very interesting because toxicity is incredibly important. It's incredibly important in content moderation, but to like treat it as this is a core thing that a language model needs to be good at. That's a really interesting choice, and it's a choice that we believe should be framed as needing to be informed by ethical risks, needing to be informed by ethical values, needing to be informed by the social part of this puzzle. Second layer that is going to be familiar for folks in the AI auditing space that we zero in on is questions of validity. So I'm thinking of us AI auditors, AI risk management folks. We're thinking of hiring algorithms. We're thinking of things like emotion detection algorithms. And we're asking, sure, your model is giving a score. Is that score measuring anything real? Is it measuring anything meaningful? Is it measuring anything significant? And in a lot of the statistics and science world, these are framed as validity concerns. There's a lot. Validity is extremely complex, extremely rich. The thing we do is just we flag and we go into a little bit more details, but we believe that the selection of like what standards are you bringing to thinking about the validity side of machine learning research as one that also needs to be informed by ethical risks. And there's the third one, which is a little tricky to measure. That's a part of the paper where we get into considerations that we believe are important, but where like making the point is a little bit harder to prove. And we call this path dependence. We're like concerned with feedback loops, the way in which different kinds of models, different kinds of benchmarks reinforce what actually happens in the world and in positive feedback loops. And in the case of human intelligence research, or what we were thinking about with this like critical scholarship, is a really important point that gets made about the way in which results from human intelligence research, once they're out in the world, shape the way people are treated, shape the way people are educated. A very, very prominent example of this is the so-called black-white IQ gap in the United States, where some people have claimed that there's a gap in IQ scores between African Americans and the white population in the US. And there's, at this point, multiple decades of scholarship that is critically assessing what that does. What does that do to the way teachers treat members of different groups? And how does that, in turn, potentially impact performance on intelligence tests? So these tricky feedback loops, we think needs to be front and center and evaluated also for ethical risk. And that's a hard thing to do. So that's like a high-level overview of what happens in the paper. I want to invite folks to take a look at it if you want to hear more. At this point, I would love to move to questions, to practical problems, but also perhaps moving to thinking about solutions.
Yeah, thank you, Beau. I mean, that's so fascinating. I think, like, if I were to start at the end, like with the feedback loops, the bit that it is difficult to tackle that question, but I think it's demonstrably true, and I just have maybe yet to demonstrate it. But I think if you have a benchmark, it drives innovation.
Yes.
And I think that people have written about benchmarks being the thing that really pushes. It sets the North Star for where you put your efforts.
Yep.
And so I could easily see that, and that is a feedback loop. You know, how well you do on these benchmarks will decide how seriously people take you or what things you want to focus on. Yeah. And so you are arguing then that if you don't think about ethics, let's say for that one little piece, if you aren't considering broadly ethics or socio-technical concerns, then you might be going in a direction which is not necessarily one that people want to go in, or it's uncritical or uninformed in those. Could you think of like any scenario where that might be a big worry? Like, what's the, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I'm trying to think through, and I know this was the toughest area, so I'm pushing on the toughest area, but where could we see that sort of start blowing up?
You mean the feedback loops, right?
Yeah.
So this is hard. There's a paper called the Benchmark Lottery that gets into some of that mindset. There's like other like interesting papers that get into that territory that we cite. The thing that's on my mind here is, I mean, there's a few things, but like, one of the core things that, that's in like kind of like the practical recommendations part of the paper that's like really front of mind in thinking about like what do you need to have in mind given that there are these feedback loops? And for us, like the core mindset that we need to have is that individual solutions aren't gonna be enough. They're just not gonna be enough. Individual action will not help solve problems that involve all of these feedback loops between the research that gets done, the benchmarks that get released, the actions that people take in the world. We need to frame this problem as a collective action problem. We need to frame this problem as a problem that has to do with social structure. So like, it's not a direct answer to your question, but it's kind of like, it's like, like one of the front of mind components of this for me is like, we want to invite, and that is the hardest part. We want to invite the community to think through what might be steps that can meaningfully be taken to address the fact that this requires collective action and not just isolated action. There's one in particular, like, strategy that's very front of mind for me right now coming out of NeurIPS. I met, had wonderful conversation with Subho Majumdar at NeurIPS, who started very recently the AI vulnerability database project. And the thing that stands out from hearing, Subho talk about the project, but also, from like reading through, like I just like recently started reading through, what they're up to is the mindset of building knowledge bases that have two really, really crucial features. The first one is that they're built by with the concern of collaboratively, including, like impacted communities, flagging where are there known problems? Where are there known problems either with models, with benchmarks, or with data sets? Known vulnerabilities. But the second key component, and this is inspired, like the strategy for this is inspired by the tools that get used in cybersecurity space. The second component is, how do we organize a knowledge base of these known problems that is structured in a way that helps practitioners directly put the lessons into action? And the way they do this is through a combination of taxonomy and classification of the known problems, together with in-depth, examples and evaluations. The way I think of them, and again, I'm not deeply familiar with their work, but that's superficially my understanding is, it's a little bit like in-depth evaluations that are meant to give folks the details, including sometimes data sets, that they can then lean into in troubleshooting the work that they're doing themselves. And we think of that as a great example of a systemic solution to the kind of problem we're dealing with that involves feedback loops. It can't be the only solution. I'm personally very excited about bias bounties as another component of solutions that need to be explored. But there's many, many more. I kind of want to turn the question back to you. I'd be curious to hear what solutions to the structural part of this are front of mind for you, Shea.
Yeah, no, I think, well, I mean, this has been our big struggle. So one of our this is core to our mission, trying to mitigate these risks. And one of the key things that has to be is education. Like there has to be kind of a lattice or a foundation of education, because one of the things that I was thinking as I was listening to you talk is, I could easily see a researcher, a machine learning researcher doing, working on optimizing some neural network, thinking to themselves or thinking of themselves in some sense like a mechanic or an engineer working on a piece of a car, and then someone comes in from the outside and says, well, these cars might be used to recklessly and could kill people. And the mechanic being, or the engineer feeling like, oh, I know, but what am I supposed to do about it? Now, that's not a perfect analogy. We know that because, probably for two main reasons. One, that the research in artificial intelligence currently, or machine learning in particular, there's a real trend now towards reaching out into applications. In order to be novel, in order to kind of push forward with research, and it's the publisher perish kind of mentality that pushes people to, can I apply this in a novel area, oftentimes outside of their expertise. And so engineers in a highly structured environment don't do that. And so that's unique to AI. And the second is that sort of conversely to that, people on the outside are grabbing AI applications or the newest models, and they're applying it themselves to a variety of different things. So it's a double, from both ends, it's getting shoehorned into places where people don't understand what the implications are fully. But nonetheless, that is the attitude that a lot of engineers will have and do have. And so the education systemically, if you were to ask, how are you going to utilize those tools to inform what you do, that takes a lot of education. So you just having come from NeurIPS, how are the conversations now? It was probably self-selected that you talk to a lot of people who are interested in what you do, but have you experienced people with this sort of attitude, like, I'm not sure that if it applies to me kind of attitude?
Yes. There's a backstory, we wrote this paper very quickly thinking the ideal venue for this is the FACT conference, which is going to happen, and the call for papers is out right now. But we were working on this in the spring, and so we wanted the deadline in the spring, and we actually let's just get this out very quickly and send a version to NeurIPS. And one of the reactions we had from a lot of reviewers, and like this is like with the caveat that it was part of like the new like benchmarking track, and they're just trying to build out infrastructure, and like the review process is is very much like something that is being built out. But it was clear that for quite a few of the reviewers, the fact that it wasn't a technical paper that involves data sets was a problem. It was a problem because it made the paper less interesting to them personally, but also like they were very, very like like explicit. It's like, we don't know how interesting a paper like this is going to be to the audience. There's a backstory to this, which is that in the 2021 first edition of this benchmark track, there were 5 papers that were argument-driven position papers. Those are the papers we meant to be engaging with. Turns out that this year there isn't a single one. We were the only one that even submitted. Like, I got to see, because I was also a reviewer, so I got to see what papers got submitted to the benchmark track, and we were the only position paper. And that's basically been pushed out of the benchmark tracks. So like papers that raise concerns like what we're raising. That's the first thing, like, very personal story to say. The flip side, though, and this was like one of the most, I don't know, like, presenting a poster in a conference is an interesting experience. It's always a little bit hit and miss, but one of the really exciting moments that happened for me this week is when a researcher came to us, and they were already familiar with our paper. They'd read it, and they were like, actually, like like the core tools that you introduce, there's some conceptual moves that I haven't gone into in just like this chat, but they were saying, like, so they're a language researcher, NLP researcher. The core tools you introduce are really important to the paper that we're writing right now. And those tools are helping us do our work. So another way to like step back and like describe this is there's really a split between the parts of the AI research community that are deeply immersed, including very technical folks, but that are deeply immersed in the need to think of this as a socio-technical problem, and the parts of the community that aren't, and that don't like framing machine learning research as socio-technical research. And it's a really interesting split, and I think those conversations are ongoing. That would be kind of like, like if I had to summarize the conversation at NeurIPS, it was like, and like we had a lot of people come to us and be like, this paper is really cool, like we find it super helpful, but like, yeah, I do want to like be very explicit about the fact that we also, in this case, like got a very clear, like, this is not a technical paper, it doesn't belong here, folks, as part of this story. And that's how, like, so the paper ended up being in the, workshop track, which means it's not archival. It means we can still publish it, which we will do.
Yeah.
We've had many journals reach out to us since we made it public too, like, so, it's gonna be published eventually, but, I think in terms of like what other conversation in NeurIPS, like that's a kind of cool part of the story.
Yeah. Well, so I'd like to focus a little bit on something that's stood out to me as interesting. I mean, the parallels between what's happening, the disconnect between the ethical considerations and the technical considerations or measurement and what we see in industry, because that is a big problem. And I mean, at first glance, you would think, or at first thought, you'd think maybe in academia or in the research community, they're a little more, they think more broadly, maybe less of pressure or deadlines in terms of getting things out. And so there might be more of a tendency to try to integrate those two. Now, one thing that we recommend when we're talking to industry is this idea of cross-functional teams. And so now I want you to reflect, if you can, like on what's the, when you have a company that's trying to put out a product, bringing in someone from legal, bringing in someone from product, bringing in somebody, maybe engaging with external stakeholders. That's something that can happen. There's a sort of nimbleness to industry that allows that kind of thing to happen. But what does that look like when you're talking about something that can be as sort of rigidly set up as academia? How does that happen when you have a research group? Where does that come in? How does the sense of cross-functional play a role? And can people implement that?
Yeah. There's so many layers to the way this plays out in industry. One of them that's like top of mind for me, and it's a conversation that is really important to be having. So if we look at things like the NIST risk management framework, like one of the comments that I've seen community members do, including the folks from the AI vulnerability databases, look, this whole mindset is incredibly helpful, but how do tiny companies implement something like this? When you're an extremely large company, you can afford to build governance infrastructure that is extremely robust. You can afford to hire ethics and legal experts full time and bring them into what you're doing. But when you're a tiny startup, a major concern a lot of folks have is look, like, we need to have a minimum viable product, and we need to spend our money towards building that, like, the minimal version of what we do that our investors are going to be on board with. And that means in terms of like early spending for like tiny companies, it's extremely hard to justify spending a lot of money on roles that aren't directly related to building out the product. So basically, like, spending money on things other than engineering, and then maybe eventually product management, maybe eventually UX. I mean, but that's a later step in terms of like building out, like a machine learning startup.
Yep.
And it takes quite a while, and it takes companies that have like a decent size to be able to say we're going to hire ethicists full time here. What's the flip side of this? I mean, I'm thinking really like of like why work like what we're doing at Babel, is helpful, but also like what all the many companies that offer AI risk services. Look, to my mind, like like a core part of what folks need to have in mind is, yes, if you're in a place where you can hire folks that are deeply immersed in the ethics and the social and political side of these conversations, hire them full time, bring them in as soon as you can, if you can. If you can't, go to service providers who can help advise you on these issues. To me, that's like in terms of like when you have limited capacity, what can you do? That is it should be a must-have component. It's also, to my mind, part of why so like we're rolling out this process audit to get back to some of the stuff that's on our mind at Babel.
Yeah.
And as part of this process audit, which like is like a first version, it's a first attempt at doing something like a process audit. It's meant to be very, very minimal. We have governance requirements that are minimal, but we have governance requirements. We also require that folks do an ethical risk assessment. That means the kind of work that folks like us do, but that many other teams do. We give folks options. They can do it however they want. For the purpose of the current version of the audit, they have flexibility, but that needs to happen. Otherwise, we will not certify them.
Yeah.
They will not pass our audit, and then they get to do the technical testing. To my mind, yeah, like, if you're so small that you can't hire ethicists and folks like us full time, you need to rely on service providers who can help you bring that knowledge to the table. That would be I'm sorry for the Babel pitch, but I really think this is, an important thing to acknowledge. Yeah. Yeah,
no, I appreciate it. It's not just me doing the pitching. That's great. So I want to remind people, if they have some questions for us, you can go ahead and put it into the Q&A or the chat if the chat works. But the Q&A will definitely work. So before then, though, I want to go back to this idea of academia, though, because it's difficult for small and medium size enterprises to do this. Mm-hmm. And the solution is, I think we have a lot of material that we've given out in terms of like what's the minimal viable product for like AI governance, and then of course people can hire people like us to help them. But in academia, when you have the way research teams work is almost like there's a fiefdom where you have a professor who gets grants, gets a lot of money, and they have graduate students, and the work is really siloed, more so even than industry, into a very narrow research topic.
Yeah.
And so, this professor is working with the graduate students and postdocs to develop different algorithms, could be natural language processing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then knowing that cross-functional teams are good, so Beau comes to them at a conference and says, listen, one potential solution is getting cross-functional teams where you have people who have some ability to recognize socio-technical risk built into your team. The thing I want to figure out is, what's the strategy? Like, if we were, we don't work with universities typically on this sort of thing. There's nothing restricting us from doing it. But I'm really curious, what would be our guidance for that? Like,
Yes.
Can you go find a philosophy professor in your university? Do you get train specific? Do you train people in your graduate students on this? Like, do you start from trying to educate people within your group? Do you bring other people? Yeah. What's if somebody hired us for a particular research group to help them out, what would be our advice?
I had folks ask me this question at the conference. There's two sides to my answer. I think there's like a gold standard here, which is bring in a social people research or ethics expert into the writing for articles. Make them co-authors. There's a case that's on my mind. It's one of the papers that I found exciting. I'm really excited to dig into. From the conference, the title is "Picking on the Same Person: Does Algorithmic Monoculture Lead to Outcome Homogenization?" And the story for this paper is it's a collaboration between computer science folks, and it's like led by computer scientists, but it very prominently features Kathleen Creel, who's a philosopher who works on these issues, and it's the kind of work that just cannot happen without having folks on the people and ethics side being at the table in the writing. And I think like the gold standard, the thing that people like ideally should all be doing is bringing in ethicists as co-authors. Like, side note on this, in machine learning, it's very common to have very, very many authors. It's a field where multiple authors aren't frowned upon, and there's tons of good work that's being done by teams that recognize the importance of bringing in like social people and ethics experts into the writing process. If you can't do that, what I would like to see, besides things like ethics review, what I would like to see is more collaborative spaces for folks to come together and flag the challenges that they're encountering, the issues on which they want guidance. I would also like to see projects like the AVID database thrive and help get these conversations going. That would be like my wish list for the academic research world.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of those places where process can help. IRB, when people do human subject research, IRBs are, they force people to think about things. Yeah. But, if you're working with data that has people in it, is there a sense where an IRB, can we argue for an IRB-like process for, or when the outputs are likely to affect people? That's one process I can imagine.
That's such an important point. So the thing with IRB that's on my mind for this specific problem is, what are the trigger conditions? You're working at an institution, and normally, in the research world, IRB is like a hoop you have to go through as a researcher under specific circumstances. And so the process challenge is just getting very clear on what are the trigger conditions. You're in a CS department doing machine learning research. When do you have to send your work to the IRB team? And basically also, maybe should you just always do it? Should it always be part of machine learning research? But the trigger conditions there on the process are hugely important. The other side of this that I think is really important to have in mind and to acknowledge, and that's a point that folks make, but I feel like I'm not hearing it often enough when I hear IRB being touted as an incredible tool, which it is. It really makes a difference. But to my knowledge, IRB processes are best suited for problems and harms that are completely known quantities. There's a simple process reason for this. You send your paper and your research proposal to the IRB. They need to relatively quickly, without doing very, very deep fact finding, they need to relatively quickly be able to say yes or no, this can move forward. And this means that IRB processes structurally come with challenges in identifying problems, harms, risks that are less obvious. They're not currently completely known quantities, and that needs to be acknowledged as we, promote. And I personally do want to see IRB, not just in academia, but also in industry. I want to see, processes like that being implemented. But I also want to see acknowledgement of, the way in which a process like IRB is especially well suited for very known quantities. And that's great. That's what it should be doing. But that also means that there needs to be other steps in play. There needs to be steps through which we identify what are the non-obvious risks, what are the risks that we haven't yet spotted, what are the risks that, what are the risks that require hard risk assessment work.
Yeah.
And I want to see folks being very clear-headed about the need for both. That would be my.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, that's part of why that's part of the struggle we had developing the process audit, the criterion-based audit, is that you know you're going to miss things, and you know that you can't foresee everything, and part of requiring organizations to do a process is that it just increases the likelihood that by doing that process they can spot things that might have been missed. But there is a place for the other kind of work that we also do, which is the really deep assessment where you bring in a lot of experts and you interview a lot of people. And those ethical risk and bias assessments are if everybody could do it for every algorithm and it didn't cost a lot of money, like that would be ideal, And in some sense, I've even thought, like, as we start automating in the future, automating away a lot of jobs, what are the uniquely human things that are left to do besides just, creative stuff and enjoying life, which I think should be top priority. But there does need to be, I think, a cadre of highly skilled humans who are able to interrogate systems in very deep ways from lots of different perspectives. And I think that's a very self-serving perspective to have, but I also think there's a non-negligible probability that might be the state of affairs in the future. And so that's partly what makes this really exciting. Any last word? Go ahead, please.
Last word is just like plus one on what you just said, but I just want to flag for me personally, like the interest in the non-obvious parts of this work. Like that's where the passion and the fire is for me. And from talking to you, I think I understand that that's also where a lot of the fire and the love for this work comes. And obviously this is like what we do, and this is the kind of services we offer. But I feel like it's important to also just like say and be explicit about the fact that this is where, like, for us, this work gets so exciting. No, it's the ultimate puzzle. If you like Sudoku or if you like Wordle, this is the sort of AI meets human rights version of Sudoku. Not to minimize it into a game, but there is something very satisfying with picking apart a socio-technical system, to sort of looking under every rock to find ways in which things could go south and try to figure out ways to mitigate that. It requires like the balance too of curiosity and rigor and problems that have that feature. I love them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Beau, thank you so much. I think let me check. I don't think we have any questions that we haven't covered. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and chat with us about this, and it's super exciting research. And we'll be sure to those who are listening in, when we post this on YouTube, we'll have a link to the article and everything, so we can take a look at that, and maybe some other references if you've got some other things you want to share. Thank you. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you for showing up, and we'll see you next time on Lunchtime BABLing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.